I give a lot of credit to WSL and what they've done with their broadcast contract and the fact that they've created this carve out. It's been talked about, but I don't think people really understand the extent of having a carve out for players to post in match content.
If we look at what Michelle Kang has done with Lyon, I think we will look back at that moment and go, wow, look what she did with women's sport in Europe. And there's this saying that I always lean on, that not much grows in the shade of an oak.
Women have always been a massive part of the conversation. It's just that they haven't had the platform in the same way. And what we're seeing now is women being given this platform. And I think that's the massive point of change. I have literally been banging my head against a brick wall trying to tell people to tell the stories of the athletes. Every athlete has been through some sort of adversity to get to where they are. And 90% of them are relatable to you and I. So we can listen to these stories and actually dream of being these athletes.
Hello and welcome to the Sports Pundit Innovation Podcast, the show exclusively for the people shaping the future of sport. I first appeared on this podcast as a guest, and now I'm delighted to be returning to host my own show. Over this first 5-part series, I'll be diving in deeper with various innovators and discussing industry-shaping ideas to get you thinking. On this season finale of the Sports Pundit Innovation Podcast, we're going deep into women's sport, a category I'd argue shouldn't have the goal of catching up, but instead take a lead in creating what comes next. To test that idea, I'm joined by Rowena Samarasinhe, one of the sharpest systems thinkers in global sport. From CMS Law, SPORTFIVE, and commercial rights giant Dentsu, to working intimately with UEFA, World Athletics, and also athletes like Usain Bolt. I'm lucky to call her not only a friend and a mentor, but also a colleague as we work together under GENSport to imagine what's possible for the future of the women's sports industry. At a time when traditional models in the men's game are increasingly coming under pressure, the path for women's sport should not be a copy-paste of the men's game, but instead demand new thinking. Without further ado, please enjoy our conversation. Ro, how are you?
I'm good, thank you very much. Smiling this morning, Leanne.
Yes, indeed. Let's just go there, go straight there. The Euros, right?
Back-to-back win for the Lionesses. I mean, fantastic as an England fan, but also, I mean, what a moment for women's sport. It's, really, really, really chuffed this morning.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a Kiwi, right? Maybe I use my English heritage when it suits me, but I was jumping on the couch this morning and I believe there were tears. My 5-year-old son was celebrating alongside me, and I think it's huge. A team like this, take it out for the second time. The whole tournament shattered some stats once again. Feels like it's a whole nother shift in a good direction, basically.
And let's not forget, it wasn't an easy walk in the park for the Lionesses.
No.
You know, jeopardy is a really important part of sport. And I think, I was there at the England-France game and we did not look like tournament-winning champions. And for them to just show the grit and determination, I mean, we were sort of exchanging messages during the game and, Spain looked so strong.
Sure.
But ultimately, it came down to that last penalty. We didn't know until the end what was going to happen. And Chloe Kelly stepping up, doing her thing. I mean, it's giving me goosebumps just talking about it.
I know.
So,
yeah.
It was brilliant.
It was fitting, wasn't it? It was fitting for her to stand up there again. And I think what was her comment after the game? I don't miss twice. She's just so cool, calm, collected, right? What a character. Now, you've been involved with UEFA in the Euros for a while now. What sort of growth have you seen? I mean, we saw some massive stats coming out of this tournament, but I'd be interested to hear that from you.
Yeah, I mean, I never take it for granted what a privilege it is we have to work in sport. I moved to Switzerland 20 years ago for the Euro 2008, the men's European Championships. Then at the time, they were also in Switzerland and Austria. It was like the comparison between we hardly even talked about the women's event back then. And it was literally on the sidelines. I was incredibly fortunate to be at the last final with Visa. And it was actually tears because those guys had been on the sidelines of stands in finals before. Because it was just always this, we don't have the appetite, people won't come. And, those numbers that we've seen, we haven't got the audience figures yet, but the tournament stats, the most attended European Women's Football Championship ever, 650,000, I think it was over 100,000 or close to 100,000 from the English one. That's growth, and that's just showing you that these opportunities are there if we make it accessible, if we allow people to watch women's sport. And, Switzerland's quite a traditional heartlands, I guess. And there was some concern before the tournament, is it going to be as successful as the UK? Is
Mm,
there as much passion for women's football? And, they proved it, and
mm,
I was incredibly fortunate to be at games from Sion to Geneva to Zurich. And, Sion was a 7,000 seat stadium, sold
mm,
out.
mm.
Like everyone just really got behind the event, and there was just this great atmosphere around it the whole time. And, hats off to UEFA. They did a brilliant job. And I think, it's only up from here.
I agree. Yeah, I think I saw a stat 29 out of the 31 matches were all sold out. So
Yeah.
incredible stuff.
I loved
You
it.
know,
People were like, "Can you get
yeah,
tickets? Is there any
yeah.
secret in?" Like, people were like, at 11 a.m. in the morning. You've never heard of this like 10 years ago. It's
You had to know the
brilliant.
right people. Yeah. I
Yeah,
mean, and it takes me back, being in New Zealand, the World Cup that was, not that long ago and
yeah,
it down our way. As a footballer myself, played until about 16. I had to play with the boys. There were no girls playing football. And yet you bring a World Cup down here and I walk into our biggest stadium, 45,000 people completely sold out. New Zealand's not even playing. And you have to pinch yourself at these moments because you go,
yeah.
wow, such a shift in such a short amount of time. So, I do see the sea change. And being the Lionesses that win, what do you think that means now for women's football, particularly in obviously the UK with the WSL and throughout Europe? Does it flow on? Where to from here, do you think?
Yeah, and let's be clear. I am a massive proponent of the globalization of sport. So it's not about having one country dominant. But
Yeah,
I think the investment that we've seen in the UK, everything that's happening with the WSL, they are really being groundbreaking. I think that momentum is just demonstrating that if you invest not only just money but time and attention, you can grow a program. You can grow a team. I mean, it's not, I don't want to just talk about the Lionesses because,
yeah,
it
no,
was
yeah.
amazing to watch France. I mean, God, that game at the beginning, I just thought France,
Mm,
I actually thought France looked unstoppable.
mm,
And, the sport's been professional for 3 years in that country.
yeah,
So, and Spain, wow. I felt for
amazing,
Spain,
amazing.
because, they've got
They
sort
were
of
class. Yeah.
unbelievable players on that team. They look so great. They were incredibly unlucky. But again, I go back to jeopardy. But it's important to have jeopardy because it's important not to just have clear-cut winners. England were
That's
not
right.
a clear-cut winner during this game. So
No.
it's really important because of everything that's happening in the UK. But I love seeing these brilliant teams where we're seeing investment coming into the women's side of the game, and it's proving results.
Hmm. Yep. No, totally. As much as the Lionesses are really interesting, I have the pleasure of knowing you quite well. But for our listeners, what we always do on the Sports Pundit is really take them through your journey, like how you got here today. So really, if you could take us back, tell us about your journey in sport. It's a really busy one, obviously through law, through Dentsu, now to GENSport. So yeah, give us your journey and what moments have really shaped you.
Yeah, I think it's really important to say that I started life as an athlete, and I'm not going to bore you with the details, but for a time I was a professional sprinter, but I also had the privilege of being in Millfield where I got to play so many sports and to a high level. And while I don't play sport to that level, it's still a massive part of my life. I mentioned I've been living for Switzerland in 20 years. I'm an amateur ski mountaineer and trail runner. Mountain sports are a really important part of my life. And that's both the outdoors, the activity side of things, but really those benefits that I bang on about that
Mm,
sport gives all of us, and not only just a healthy lifestyle. So I really do try to practice what I preach, and that's not always possible, especially as when you're a founder and an entrepreneur. But that is where I come to the industry from playing sport. And I moved into the commercial world of sport pretty early in my career. I've spent the majority of the last 20 years negotiating multi-million dollar sponsorship and broadcast agreements predominantly. But I've also had the opportunity to work with some of the most prolific athletes and sporting brands in the world, like people like Usain Bolt, the All Blacks and Black Ferns. And I did that, as you mentioned, as a sports lawyer and as an entrepreneur, and most recently as the founder of my own sports businesses. But I have a real passion for change, and sport has always been a part of my life, whether it's been competing or delivering it. And I can really look back at from this position of security and recognize that I've been incredibly fortunate to have been able to translate my passion into a career. And
mm,
as a sprinter, it was, one moment that stands out for me was a real pinch me moment when I watched Bolt break the 100, the 200, the 4x100 meter world records. in Berlin at the World Championships in 2009.
Mm.
And that was my job, and it was, I remember just sat there and the number of people who just said to me like, "Oh, wow, you were just mesmerized." And I just thought, this is amazing. I'm happy. I'm done.
Yeah.
I don't need to
Yeah.
do anything else
I can
now.
retire. Yeah, you know you're
Um,
doing something right, don't you, when those moments come across you, and that's part of
yeah.
your job.
And
Yeah.
I mean, and there've been so many since then, that is one, but yeah, I wake up every morning and that's been a massive driver for me to have purpose and meaning in what I do, and to not have that Sunday night feeling when you sort of dread work, which,
Oof, yeah.
I probably did at my law firm, but really doing something that just gets you excited.
Yeah. No, exactly. And you speak about change, and obviously now you've followed your career heavily into women's sport.
Yeah.
Is there a moment, or was it many moments? What's the point where you go, yeah, wow, this is not just for fun and passion anymore. This is not just about equality. There's something here.
I mean, not only have I always been a woman who played sport, but I've also spent most of my career working in Olympic sports. And the Olympics is still the biggest event on the planet. And when you look at a lot of those sports, athletics, swimming, volleyball, and I've commercialized these rights as well as the sort of traditionally male dominated sports as well. But, women have always been a massive part of the conversation. It's just that they haven't had the platform in the same way. And what we're seeing now is we're seeing women being given this platform. And I think that's the massive point of change. But we've mentioned some of the data, and I'm sure we will go into it, but
Mm.
it's growing, and no one can dispute that. Where numbers are going up and money's coming in, there's opportunity, and I think that's what's critical about this moment that we're seeing right now.
Yeah, and I think I totally agree, right? I think it's to do with that platform. I think that playing field has completely leveled, right? And this is to do with social media and streaming and that sort of democratized access to content. Because you go, well, back in the day, an emerging league, which would have been women's sport, needed a platform and needed an end to buy into it. And we didn't get it, right? We had what, maximum 4% or something like that of the media coverage.
Yes, exactly.
And so that is the sea shift that we're seeing, I think, and that's what makes this opportunity, I think, an unstoppable train. And we're here today to talk innovation, right? So being that it is this space when women's sport is coming to the fray, coming to the forefront, it's really having its moment. And then you look at, I guess, the legacy model, right? So this is sort of the argument or conversation, shall we say, that we want to have today. You sort of have to look at legacy sport. And I don't really want to use the word broken, but it's under stress, right?
Yeah.
There's, sports leagues, they're struggling to reach younger audience. They're accelerating in their decline. What's your take on why it's stagnating like it is, or why it's kind of slowing down?
I mean, I think it's really important also to say that, we've never had more choice in our lives.
Yeah.
When I grew up, certainly I would watch Grandstand on a Saturday, and
Mm.
that was my download of sport. And that was everything, everything that you could see. It was football, athletics, horse racing, everything at once. Whereas now, I mean, you can put the TV on and watch cricket all year round, like 24/7. Like, it used to be a summer sport. That's one example. So
Mm.
I think there's that element that, yes, there are however many more billions of people on the planet, but there's
Mm.
also like so much to choose from. And that saturation point is something that everyone is looking at. But I don't think that I'm not sure I'd say I would go as far as say it's broken. I just think
Yeah.
it's different. Sport was built as sport wasn't built as a business. Sport was built as a community product that's become this billion-dollar business, but it was definitely built for linear TV. And
Yeah.
so in person or watching on a screen, 90 minutes of football or a full day of athletics, or, all these sorts of original structures. Yeah, I came to cricket through the one day game. 1996, Sri Lanka won the one day World Cup, and now I love the Test game. But it was something different that brought me into it because I had this perception of what the sport was. And I
Mm.
think that's really critical when we're looking at sort of different tastes, the way that the next generation consumes life in general. They're not necessarily going to games, or I mean, well, they are, but not everyone is. And I think
Yeah.
it's how do you appeal to those people who wouldn't traditionally be sports fans? And we have all these tools now to do it in a very different way. We don't have to just rely on BBC TV or Sky Sports. There's ways to attract, especially that younger generation who might just
Mm,
watch 3 minutes of the final last night,
mm,
but they're still engaged.
mm.
That's all they need to get the highlights, to get the moments, and will still be passionate Lioness fans. And I think that's the real difference, because you weren't a hardcore football team supporter unless you were day in, day out in the stands, in the rain. That was a true fan. And I
Yeah.
think that definition of a true fan's massively changed, and we just need to move with that.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I sort of come at it from a point of view that, the real shift is the fandom, right? That center of fandom, sports fandom has moved. And when you're a legacy product, you were created for another time where that wasn't there, right? So now what you've got is a product market fit issue.
Mm.
And then you come to the women's game, and effectively what you've got is this clean slate advantage, right? And I think what's really interesting is you go, well, women's sport doesn't have to undo anything, but also where do you start? Do you know what I mean? Like, as in, where do you put this? And is attaching it then to this model that is under stress, shall we say, the right way to go about it and the right way to measure it? I'll be interested to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that clean slate point is really important. And, I don't want to use the word learning from mistakes, but
Yeah,
it is
yeah.
a little bit of that. And it's
Mm,
learning from evolution and just not simply replicating the same model, because things have really moved on since when
mm,
and I think we're sort of talking about football here, but it's actually all sports.
yeah.
And, we've got this chance to look at it differently, but I think it does require us to look at it differently. And I think that's where, certainly outside of the US, I feel that we're struggling to see its unique setting points, I guess. And
Mm,
and that's where I think I'm such a proponent of diversity of thinking, because if you have people who look the same, think the same, you're always just going to make the same decisions. Whereas having people who, I sort of call it future proofing, because people who think differently, I know that I don't know that the young generation, even the way that you do, yeah, like that's why I have you here, um, to tell me all these things. But I think it's recognizing our own limitations and understanding that if we want to really shift the needle, you
mm.
need all those different voices in a room. I love to sort of use the example of blockbusters.
We did, but they're obviously not here anymore.
It was the video store on every street corner, and you never envisage a world without blockbusters. And I'm pretty
Mm,
sure the board of blockbusters thought that. And it is
yeah.
literally, best example of a
Mm,
business that became irrelevant overnight. And I think if you do just rest on your laurels and you just sort of are complacent, think, we have a brilliant product and it is what it is. And I think that's the danger for men's sport. I'm not saying that
yeah.
it's going to be a blockbuster, but
No,
certainly some sports, and my passion for rugby, and we talk about that sport a lot, and I
absolutely.
think it's having
Yeah.
some really difficult times. And part of me does think, is that just because you thought you could fill Twickenham like every day and in charge of these amounts of money for it, and people will keep coming, and
Mm,
you've actually got to evolve the product in order
mm,
to. And I think that's what fans are asking for. Come back to this idea of fandom. Fans
mm.
are demanding this now, they're not just asking for it.
No. And I think, you look at the last decade, we've kind of used every excuse under the sun as to why Gen Z isn't interested. We're like, it's their attention. It's everything. It's not us, it's them. And then I think we've finally got to the point where we go, oh, no, no, it is us. We need to change, and rugby union is a perfect example of something that's just sat there, not evolving. In some ways, kind of stubbornly refusing to evolve, which maybe, just maybe, it'll help it. Who knows? When everything else kind of evolves, the zig and the zag, what's against it, maybe it's the attention. Um, but what's interesting to me is I think cricket was this exactly the same as rugby, maybe it's
100%.
15 or 10 years ago, and look at the difference between the two sports
Well,
now.
and people, like, forget, I don't know if they forget, or if lots of people don't know that cricket in India was struggling before the
Yeah,
IPL. And it's crazy now because we look at India as this dominant
gold.
superpower, and especially
That's
in
it.
cricket. But yeah, they were struggling. I mean, unless you had Sachin Tendulkar playing, people wouldn't
Mm,
watch the game. And
mm,
so, it's a lot of luck, I think, but a brilliant
mm.
example of thinking outside the box and how the one day game started that, then the 2020 version, and now the uprising that test games having because of the impact of that. So there's ways to do it. And I think
Yeah.
the role of federations is really important in terms of maintaining consistency, grassroots growth around the world. They are antiquated systems
That's right.
with very antiquated decision making, stifled decision making. So there is a role for innovation outside of that, but sort
Mm,
of with the blessing of the federations is the
that's
sort of
right.
how I sort of
Yeah.
always describe it, and recognizing what they've done, and not just dismissing that history, because I think it's
Mm.
it's doing both.
Yeah. At some point, that those national organizations need to hop out the way and let, and this comes back to fandom, right? I have a theory on this, which we're going to go down rabbit holes if we're not careful. But I think that international kind of level of the game across any sport is actually still divides global fan base, right? Like,
Yeah.
yes, okay, I tuned into England last night, but I have English blood, so maybe there's a reason there. But by and large, I don't support another country. That's hard to do.
Mhm.
And I think when you go down to a club level, we can feel passion for a city. It's different. It's not like we go to war with cities. We still do things at countries that divide us. And so I think when you pull it down and you think about cricket coming down into the kind of club level and IPL, it engages a total addressable market that you can't get from an international game. I don't care if Australia's playing South Africa in cricket. I'm not going to tune in. I'm a cricket fan, but I won't tune in. But put two IPL teams on, I'm there. So I think there's something that, because the world can now tune in, there's a bigger total addressable market by doing that. So I think those models, when you bring it away from international, there's a lot of interesting things there that kind of need to be this mainstay. But then to bring it back to women's sport, and we'll go with cricket because we were already there, is that you look at where, and I think this is again a really interesting point and possibly learning for football too. Women's cricket has really kind of focused on, they haven't really gone, hey, let's give test cricket a go, or one dayer for that
Mhm.
matter. We're going to go hard at the 100 and we're going to go hard at the IPL. And isn't that interesting, right? They're taking the formats that are kind of trending right now, popular right now, and they're not trying to catch up in some ways. And I wonder what you think about football in the same sense, because largely, if you had to be critical, you'd say football's following the 11v11 model that men have been playing for many, many, many years. Is there another way to think about this? And I agree that before we go there, there isn't really an alternate model to football, but we are starting to see seeds of that coming through with these sort of alternative leagues.
I know what you're
Yes.
doing here, Leanne. You're trying to
Yeah.
pull me down this. Listeners, this is what Leanne does all the time to me. No, I think, on cricket, I think it's really important to also say that yes, but they are like they're structuring it differently. So the
Yeah.
tour when India tours England in the women's game, they'll play every single formats. They'll play tests, they'll play one day, and they'll play T20.
Yeah.
So they're not the focus like the Ashes is a 5 test series in the same way, but they will do everything. Um, I think I think that they are. I think they are thinking of it differently as a different product. An example of this is when I was asked for my opinion on what a women's British Lions tour could look like.
Mm,
I was like, I don't think it's going to be the same as a men's one, where you would literally do every 4 years to New Zealand or every 4 years to
mm,
Australia.
mm,
You would actually potentially make it into like a tournament where you have multiple teams participating,
mm,
because that's just the reality of the women's game. So I think that whole angle of looking at differently is really important. Yes, on football, I have very often been heard to say I think we should just stick another player on the pitch just so that people start looking at it differently. I do agree with you. I think we are trying to recreate a lot of things in the men's game that don't necessarily work, because we don't have the same level of tribalism and things like that. And that's a good thing as well
mm,
on the women's side of the sport. Yes, I do think there's a place for these alternative leagues. And yeah, I think Kings and Queens are so interesting. We had the World Sevens earlier this year, the week of the Champions League final in Portugal, and it was brilliant. It was energetic. It was exciting. I spoke to a lot of the players who had never really played this format before, and
yeah.
they loved it. And it wasn't gimmicky. They went out hell for leather, attacking football. By the time I sat down and watched the Spurs Man United Europa final, it just felt boring. And then by the time I got to Champions League final, it just felt a little bit defensive. It was
Mm,
amazing to see this different style of forward. Do I think I go as far as changing the size of goals and things like that? That I think is a little bit more
yeah.
complicated because it also affects where you can play a lot of sports. But
Mm,
I think changing our way of thinking is really important, and I think there are places for all of these things. I do think I come back to the federation structure and the importance of what's been built. And yes, could a WSL become a 7x7 tournament? Probably not, just because they need to think about things like Champions League qualification, and
mm,
those are real commercial moments for women's sport. So it's really important, and also that the women are playing 11-a-side football. Do you think there's space for playing? And I was CEO of World 12s. I didn't think 12s rugby was going to replace 15s. But I thought 15s players playing
constant.
12s would change their style of rugby
Mm,
and run the ball more and make the game more exciting. And
mm,
that's where I think some of these disruptor leagues have the propensity, in the same way that T20 cricket did it for the Test game. It
yeah.
just play a different style that you're not used to that can really invigorate something. So I think that thinking for the women is, how can we do that without um, what's the word? Prejudicing their opportunities of
The
playing at
balance.
the highest level. But I think thinking like that is a good start.
Yeah. I mean, I think there is an opportunity to somewhat look at first principles, right? Like go back to pare it right back and go, okay, what could we do? We don't want to necessarily scale that mountain of the traditional model. But you're right. We talk about a clean slate advantage. It's not entirely clean, I guess. There is some things that we have to stick to. There's some things that just have to be because we
And
won't survive without them.
And it's different, and that's why I do sort of say the US versus the rest of the world, because, the
Mm,
US is a franchise product. Sport went to the US as a business, and they built leagues and structures that they could
mm,
commercialize them. And there's independence, there's autonomy, there's jeopardy. Like, you could win a league one year and lose the next
mm,
because of the structure of it. And that creates investment potential because you're not buying a team that's going to consistently sit at the bottom
dominant.
of the league, or vice versa. So when you're looking at it like that, but equally, let's not forget the massive pros of what community sports built. And we've got these massive heritage brands that
Mm,
have incredibly strong pulling power. So it's commercial in a very different way. But unfortunately, because of the structure, it's a
mm,
bit more complicated. So in the case of women's football, it's not simply a case of, cutting everything up and separating it out, because actually, there's some parts of those men's brands that you want to retain. It's just making them not just be men's brands, which is it's easier said than done.
that's right. Especially when you've got the size of the IPs you're talking about. But let's go there. Like you've brought this up, and I think this is a very interesting comparison, if you will. You go to the US market,
Mm.
and I think probably the WNBA is probably the best example of this. And I'm actually not too sure on the origin story or the reason why. It's something I must actually research. But you go, we're starting the WNBA. We're going to go with our own IPs. We're not going to use the men's IP, which is a phenomenal thing to do. I think the US must have had this, I guess, ambition to have a league of their own. Maybe it was the movie from whatever, the 80s or whatever. They went out and wanted to really go their own way. Same could be said about the NWSL, which is very different to what you've got in the UK and Europe, where
Mm.
effectively what these women's teams are derivatives of their men's product. They're not standalone. They are what they are. And what they're dealing with is, this massive weight of IP that is so entrenched in it, something that was never built for them, wasn't ever a part of them. And so I'd love to discuss that with you, the difference between the two, what that means, what we do in Europe, UK, what can one learn from the other, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and a really simple example actually is, commercial. Like, I come from a very traditional commercial background where, we sold advertising boards and didn't really like to stick banners on TVs, and it was like not over commercializing products. And then you look at the US, where even like 20 years ago, they were commercializing every single opportunity of the screen, basically.
Mm,
And it was
mm,
like,
mm,
oh, how do we get that balance right? And it's, again, it comes down to what people are used to. And in the US, they were much more used to seeing that, whereas in the rest of the world, we'd see that and we would just think we were being oversold to. We were like, just let us watch our sport and leave us alone.
Mm,
And I think it's a similar sort of conversation when you're talking about franchise products in the US. You know, people, a sports fan in the US has been used to seeing a product in a certain way that, the LA Rams, I was with them not that long ago. They've had 3 different locations. And, you could you imagine picking Spurs up and sticking them in Newcastle?
no.
You'd never do it. I mean, rugby tried to do it with Wasps, moving them to Coventry, and that was a disaster. But,
Mm,
there's just a very different attitude to fandom and what it means to be an LA Rams supporter
mm,
in the US to what it means to being a Spurs supporter in the UK. And I think that is a really important difference, because then when they were setting up these women's leagues, there wasn't the necessity to attach yourself to the concept.
mm,
Actually, you knew you could build something from scratch. And of course, we
mm,
know that some teams have done it a lot better than others. And it's the ones who've just been like much more innovative in their thinking. The brands like Angel City, I'm going to give a shout out to Julie here, and what they've done with that and created a
mm,
different narrative around it to make them followed by people all over the country and the world. So there is that element of it that I think is really important. And yeah, I think it's not that straightforward in the UK, although, what
mm,
we ask with women's fandom is that, you can be a Man City supporter on the men's side, but support Arsenal because you believe in what they're building.
yeah.
So it's not quite as separated as the US, but I think the women's game is this opportunity. There is a lot to be said for separating brands, but in the right way, so that you're not marginalising those very traditional supporters who will be Arsenal through and through and therefore support the women as a result of it.
Hmm. Yeah, we've discussed it at length, but you're much more diplomatic than myself. But, if we look at what Michelle Kang has done with Lyon
Hmm.
and the rebrand there, and I think we will look back at that moment and go, wow, look what she did with women's sport in Europe and how she actually broke away. And there's this saying that I always lean on that not much grows in the shade of an oak. And I think there could be a day, I mean, this is a statement, so don't hold it against me, listeners, but you could argue there is a case for Barcelona to split out their women's team and give that a whole new brand. They've got the platform, they've got the base. Now give it its own space. And I think with fandom and that core shift that we've already talked about, what's going to become more important than ever is the brand. The vibe that's around it. You spoke about Julie and Angel City, and they've done a fantastic job of that. People from all over the world can speak about that brand and what it means, whether they've seen the team play or not, they wear that merch.
Yeah.
And so I think these women's teams that are kind of bolted on or stuck underneath, shall we say, these shady oaks of these massive, massive men's IPs, until we see it, we will never be sure, but there has to be a good argument to go break that out, give it its own brand, give it its own oxygen. Wouldn't you say?
I think so, and you're right. I'm going to be very diplomatic here, and you know better than most that I was involved in trying to acquire a women's team last summer and complications that came with that. I think it's, and I agree with you. I think what Michelle's doing is brilliant. I think it's also a little bit scary for investors. Like you're looking at it and you're thinking, okay, the only way I'm going to be able to do this and do this successfully is by plowing a ton of money into it. That
Mm,
I'm not really 100% clear on where that ROI is coming back.
mm,
It's brilliant that Michelle can do this and she can be in
mm,
that position that she can solely be driven by what she thinks is the right thing. And she will make money 100%. She is
mm,
building a brand that has value in itself. Whether you could do that at every level of the pyramid is questionable. And, we've seen that on the men's side. We've seen people putting so much money into clubs upgrading stadiums and overspending without the
mm,
money coming in first, and it hasn't worked. And again, that comes back to a little bit of the broken model with men's sport. It was originally local millionaires who were passionate about their local team. Then it became sort of private equity stepped in, and now it's ultra high net worths, these multi-club owners from a lot from the US.
mhm.
Who's next to buy those? Sovereign states, and then what happens?
Yes.
And I think that's a really important element of what we think. Like, how do you make your money back? It's equity increase, and who's going to keep buying these things? So yes, it's such a fine line and it's so difficult because it can work in some cases. And yeah, she's been incredibly smart with her selection of London City Lionesses. There's not a lot of teams that have their own women only brand, but is that necessarily the right answer for Europe? I think there's also an element to sort of keeping some of the heritage if you can. But I think every case is unique and you sort of have to look at it. And I'm really intrigued as to what her next move is going to be because, I've looked at a lot of these clubs, especially around Europe, and that for her model, there's not so many options. Leanne is a huge brand,
With
huge
exactly right. Yeah.
men's football brand, and she's done it really well in that, so much so that she's more successful than the men there now and is stepping in to help them out. So,
Which is wild, right? Yeah. And I think like we're lucky for that, right? Because we get this someone to go out there in front, kind of, go out and plant a flag, see if it works,
yeah,
experiment for the rest of the industry to see, does this work? Can this work? And I suspect, my statement around Barca is absolutely not would be the answer, and it will never happen anyway. And when you look at how
it's
well,
complicated with Barca as well, in the same way in the
oh yeah, I mean
German
that's like
system because of
I'm looking at the shirt, so
membership.
that's like yes, probably the worst case. Did you
It's
try that?
I've spoken to the Germans quite a lot about the system and it's a similar,
Yeah.
how do you the fan involvement is different. Speak to Maggie about Lewis, and it was a similar sort of conversation around how you bring investment into these clubs in the right way, and it's complicated. It's much easier when you have an ownership group and a business-minded ownership group who are focused on growing the commerciality of a product, which isn't the case for Barcelona.
No. And you have to argue, look, this is what I do. I think about these crazy questions, but then I also think of the other side and you go, it's already working to a long, long way. We started out with some stats around Euros and the rest of it. Without changing the model, without changing the brands, these things are already working. So really what I wanted to kind of do now is skip forward. We're coming to time. So I need to be careful of that. But I want to spend some time now looking ahead, right? So we've talked about some proof points. We've looked at what's working. But really, I kind of think about, in a lot of ways, that women's sport, a bit like what Michelle's doing, is a chance to go out there and put your flag out in front and go, what is happening here? What is possible? What does it look like when sport is designed to fit today's fan? And this is where I think innovation comes in, not just for the women's game, but also for the men's game that's going to have to evolve. And I wanted to ask you really, in terms of what you see in the women's market, and not just football. I know we spend a lot of time on football, but where is the low hanging fruit for you? Where can you see, I guess, opportunity to innovate and really kind of change the way they're looking at their women's properties?
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of I give a lot of credit to WSL and what they've done with their broadcast contract and the fact that they've created this carve out. It's been talked about, but I don't think people really sort of understand the extent of having a carve out for players to post in match content. And for me, that's huge because, I've worked with broadcasters my entire career who just won't let you do anything
Mm.
because they don't want anything to, understandably, they're protecting their IP, which is their ability to commercialize and get viewership. But actually, this isn't taking viewership away. It's actually driving traffic too. So to how we started this conversation around, the majority of younger generation fans not sitting down and necessarily watching 90 minutes of a football match,
Mm.
they might be scrolling on their Instagram and see a clip of Chloe's like setup of that moment and then literally switching on the TV as a result of that. I think that is really quite groundbreaking. And I also think the reason it's so important when we're having this conversation is it's because it is shifting a mindset. And I think what that's going to show is that, and that's why I'm waiting to see what viewing figures will be like moving forwards, because actually, I'm hoping that just shows that actually it drives more traffic to traditional broadcast means. But actually, it's like, how can we engage these new fans and then is thinking differently? So I think it's having innovative minded partners. It's having people who are brought in. Those are people that I'm regularly in the room with. I've spent a lot of this Euro sat with people who are thinking much more broadly, and how do we do things differently in the women's game. But having that openness, I think, to take these risks, but also,
Yeah.
not taking away from WSL and their strategy around it and what they're pushing for.
Mm,
Why you need people who think differently making these decisions, why you need
absolutely.
pushing that. So low hanging fruit, I think, is challenging, because again, then I'd say go to the US because that like that's simple. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about the rest of the world. And I think it's the I'm trying to be diplomatic here and political, and not talk too much about what I was doing last summer. But I had an incredible CEO who was bought into the women's team, and I think
Mm,
that's really important, to have an executive team who understand the value of their women's team, and they're not just thinking of it as I think that you've used the word sidecar before, which I liked. It's actually, this has its own opportunity. Let's make it easy for people to be fans, and they will come,
mm,
without just saying today overnight we're going to compare it to the men's team and it's not delivering, and therefore we can't look at it the same way.
mhm,
You need owners and management teams to really be, and that to me is the low hanging fruit. Who
mm,
am I speaking to? I'm speaking to people who are passionate about their women's team, but also recognize their own limitations.
mhm. And then are there still in your mind clubs out there that sort of think of this, as the corporate social responsibility of their club, and, it becomes, I guess, a cost center as opposed to a great
I
opportunity?
mean,
What we
that's the reality.
think.
It's the reality of, they're still massive cost centers until we start seeing women's teams driving revenues, which is happening, but not happening across the board. But again, you have to invest not just money, but time, energy, and effort to change these things. And we are talking about a very different product. So clubs that are doing that exercise are going to see return, because those numbers are going up. It's about getting that balance right. But unfortunately, like I said, the football pyramid is huge, and there are a lot of clubs lower down who are struggling to maintain their men's teams, leave alone. It's not just a women's sport problem, it's a sport problem. When you don't have disposable income to be able to invest into a women's team, then it's difficult to do that. So
Yeah.
very easy for us to judge and to see teams shutting down their women's sides. But for those who aren't able to even maintain the men's sides, that's their best chance of growing revenue, unfortunately.
Yeah. No, I think you raised some really good points around the WSL, the carve out that they've got. It's an incredibly smart move
Yeah.
giving that to players, because we know, again, with that shift of fandom, that fandom now is athlete over team, right? So team is actually secondary. The way we will align fans to teams will be via the players, via social media, via that connection. And if we feed them this, they get the kind of fuel to put out there.
And that's not new. I mean,
No?
honestly, since
Yeah.
I've been working in sports, I have literally been banging my head against a brick wall trying to tell people to tell the stories of the athletes. I
Yeah.
mean, every athlete has been through some sort of adversity to get to where they are, or the journey, and
They all
and
have a story.
and 90% of them are relatable to you and I. So we can listen to these stories and actually dream of being these athletes. And
Mm,
sport as an industry has always done a terrible job. And I think part of that is also the history and the legacy of, okay, we're a team and it's about the team. It's not just about one individual person. But,
mm,
but the reality is that individuals create fandom now, and we just have to get out of that mindset. And again, I think I go back to that point. There are structures to disrupt outside. You have the
yeah.
traditional national team base, and you focus on the Lionesses. It's not just about one, two, three people. It's about all of them. And actually, that's what, if you listen to any of the interviews last night, every time a player was singled out, they were like, "It's
That's
all of
right.
us. We've all turned up. We've all been here." So I get that. But then on the other side of the coin, and like leagues and whatever, or alt leagues, all these things that you like to talk about,
Mm,
that's the opportunity for us to really drive it through the individuals. And so I think,
mm,
going back to that WSL point, it's a real moment to have a traditional league
mm,
actually saying, we're going to give players the opportunity to have their autonomy. Because yeah, I mean, athletics, I'm going to come back to that. We were so reliant on Usain for so many years, and I was just
yeah.
sat there going, "Oh God, I hope he doesn't
Yeah.
get injured.
Injure himself.
No
Yeah.
doping scandal, or there's something. You're just, when you put all your eggs in one basket." And I think there's just, I mean, Aries Merit. to 2015. He won bronze and then had a kidney transplant the next day. I mean, how many people knew that story? But how
Yeah.
brilliant a story is that? The
Yeah.
maternity stories, the players, athletes coming back from having babies and competing at the highest level. These are just examples. There are so many out there, and now I think we really need to focus on that.
Yeah. No, exactly. And I think that is the opportunity for the women's game because of the way that females come across and engage on social media too, right? Like the stats are all over this. Particularly female athletes really have the lion's share of engagement in these mediums because they naturally kind of can do that.
Yeah, and I'm going to bring the commercial angle in here because that's what this is all about ultimately, and that generates revenue. I mean, there's
Yeah.
numbers out there showing this. I think around
Mm,
50% of all sports fans now watch women's sport, but
mm,
then, like the numbers are much more swayed towards, I think it's 68%, I think it was. Sorry, I haven't got the number in front of me. Of people believe that a woman athlete promoting a
that's right.
brand
I read this
is
too. Yeah.
genuine and authentic. They're not just being paid to do something. So if you're a brand and you're seeing these numbers, it's just a no-brainer. Women's sports sponsorship has that authenticity. How does it set itself apart? I think the measurements we need to shift from, it's not just eyeballs, I think it's loyalty, customer satisfaction, things that are really key in marketing speak. Actually,
Mm,
they apply so much more on the women's side of sport than they do on the men's side.
mm,
And when you're a brand trying to gain value, like package that up, box it, and market it.
exactly.
That's the way that we're going to make money here. But it just requires people to think slightly differently. And I think that nervousness, shall we say, but I think when you do think differently, people are seeing the returns.
Yeah. And I was reading another stat just to add to that as well. I think what's amazing is the women's sports market has captured that younger audience. I read a stat, and this is quite crazy. I had to read it off my page here, but only 9% of the women's sports fans are over 65 years old. Majority are under 40. And that is
Wow.
literally the opposite story if you went for the men's,
Yeah.
whatever, men's sport or whatever, group it together. And so I think, again, there's this interesting brand proposition that goes, you can't get this anywhere else. You can't get that level of engagement at that target audience. So there is something very, very interesting here. And that I'm going to make you late for your next meeting, but that kind of brings me to KPIs, right? So just to kind of wrap this up, so a few short fire things. I've got my favorite KPI, which is shareable moments. I think,
Mm.
you've touched on this, the WSL, I think things that can go out there, spin around the internet are ultimately the porch lights, the things that are going to bring things. And I think we're going to be, as an industry, measuring shareable moments like crazy in no time at all. But I wonder what you think the most overlooked KPI in women's sport today, it can be the example you've already used, but I'd just be really interested for your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think brand loyalty. I think
Mm,
that's and again, it's only because I've spent years talking to brands. I've sold tier two sports, and I've had to justify to brands why they invested into these sports because they're like, yeah, ultimately, I'm a sports manufacturer. Is this investment going to sell me more shoes? That's the simplest target. That broadcasters right now are saying, do we invest in the Olympics when actually we can make 3 Netflix movies and make a ton more money? So everyone is having this moment when they're having to justify internally escalation when businesses are like, we have to make money. So
mm,
for me, it's actually showing brands where they're getting ROI, and it's an old stat, but it's from the World Cup in 2023, where every dollar invested created a $7 return on investment for brands, not just media valuation. I think that's the key thing. It's all around actually, am I selling more products as a result of
mm,
this?
mm.
And we can measure those things now in a way that we couldn't in the past.
Correct.
But that ability to translate how a sports sponsorship translates into me buying a pair of shoes.
Mm,
And I think that is much more, it's merchandise as anything. Turn up at a women's sport game and you will spend so much more money. So let's not raise ticket prices. Let's
mm,
just make it easy for people to get in the door and
mm.
spend money in different ways.
Yeah.
I'm going to look at it with my commercial hat on because I do think that this is a real commercial opportunity that if we do it right, let's see how we can get products out the door. An example is mascots. It's not just unique to women's sport, it's any sport. Why do we never just make 3 times the number of mascots? Because I will guarantee you every tournament will sell out. And there's an opportunity. We're taking money off the table. But again, I had to justify this to my licensing partners who were saying, well, we're taking the risk if we don't sell it. But I cannot think of an event that I worked on where we have not sold out of mascots. And the Euros, I was sat on the plane on the way back from Zurich last week, and the man next to me was complaining because he's like,
Where's the
this is the
mascot?
first time I haven't got a mascot, and they sold out like a week ago in a 4-week tournament. So, let's just give people the opportunity to spend money
Yeah.
with us because they want
Yeah.
to.
Yeah. No, I agree. Very cool. Okay. And then last lightning round question, but under the radar women's sports market, where do you think what's set to explode? What are you picking? Where do you go with this?
I mean, I think you are still again trying to lure me into the out league debate. Netball for me is a massive one. I mean, I know it's only played in a certain number of countries, but you look at the participation numbers of these sports among young girls, like that translates to fandom. So it's all relative. I'm not saying we're going to be earning multi-millions like we do in football, but I think that again, like, the numbers are translating. So I think it's those leagues that are really starting to think differently. So yeah, it's pulling in the out leagues, but keeping that sort of traditional side of it, because ultimately people want to see the players that they know and love. But to give you your moment, I think the Sidemen sold out Wembley in 24 hours.
Yeah,
So,
very true, right? And you think about that for a minute, because they're not even footballers for a start. So no one's turning up to watch the quality. The quality of entertainment, yes, but not sport.
so the influencer brand as a sports brand is something. So, but I don't want to take away from the hard work that the athletes put in to become
No,
international superstars. And I'd like to see a world where they are still, leading the charge. But I think that overlap between sport and entertainment is really important. And I think
yeah.
people who get
And again, I think women athletes are primed to take that place, right? And there'll be this perfect balance and this perfect mix that gets found, right? And I think the best example, and again, coming back to a sport we both love, is Ona Ma, rugby
yeah,
player. Absolutely not the best rugby player in the world, right? I think everyone can agree that. Phenomenal athlete still. Last year, I think I read the stat, last year, more impressions on TikTok than Taylor Swift. Just let that sit for a second,
Rowena. I
right?
feel very
Yeah.
upset that we only bring her in at this stage of the conversation. But yes,
It is. It's actually, yeah, that. I mean, given which, especially when we're talking about women's sport, I mean, she
yeah,
is unreal, right? And
yeah.
I think she is the perfect mix of performance and personality that will not stop in this world. Like, she is
And
what we're looking for.
authenticity,
Yeah,
she's saying I know, to give Taylor Swift credit, the messages that they're giving out there are things that young girls can relate to,
that's
like
right.
Taylor Swift, we've all her heartbroken, Elena Ma, we've all thought our thighs are too big. It's just all of those sorts of messages that you listen to and you see these superstars, like
Yeah,
it is clearly the way
you go,
forward.
I'm not alone, or
Yes.
whatever it might be, right? Yeah. Yeah.
No, even now.
No, I mean, yeah, and I think that's again where the outsized gains we over index in women's sport will be great at this. There's
Yeah.
so many more Onomars to come. I think that's what's so exciting. Okay, now I've taken enough of your time. To wrap us up, where can people reach out to you, find more about what you're doing, what you're up to next, where to connect? Yes, send us home. And then, of course, as always, as Andy always does, anything to finish us off and wrap us up as well.
Yeah, so I'm on LinkedIn. Instagram is probably my social of choice. And also our website, gen-sport.com. You can reach out to us via there. I would just say, look, we saw it last night. Keep watching the women, because that is the way. Read about them. Women's sports fans have traditionally been the hardest working sports fans, as Judy Ehrman once said in a room with me. And I think it's right. Let's make it as easy as possible, but we have to show that we want this. And so the more we do it, the more that's creating opportunity, creating food for people to fuel it. And I think, everyone has a part to play in that. So yeah, follow the athletes, listen to them, cheer for them. And yeah, it's coming.
No, it's exciting. Pleasure doing it with you. Thank you for joining us today. Thanks for listening to the Sports Pundit Innovation Podcast. In the show notes, you'll find more info about today's guest and the topics covered. Visit sportspundit.co to find previous editions of the podcast, access the newsletter, sign up to our WhatsApp community, and join us at an upcoming social event in cities all around the world. See you again soon.